Finally, a cool lens from Sony. This is the new 28 to 70mm f2 GM. And after lenses that arguably didn't set the world on fire, like the new 85 1.4 Mark II, for example, which I know a lot of people were hoping for something more attention-grabbing, like an f1.2 aperture with that lens, Sony is finally throwing down the gauntlet at their competition from the likes of Canon and saying, hey, we can make a 28 to 70mm lens at f2 as well, but ours is going to be smaller, dramatically lighter, sharper, and cheaper. So, if you are a Sony user that has been jealous of your Canon friends for having such a cool lens, well, now you have something even better. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing this magical new lens from the perspective of a wedding filmmaker, telling you if it's a good choice for you to purchase if you film weddings or corporate or commercial videos, documentaries, etc. And speaking of wedding filmmaking, if you want help booking your next wedding, I have a free workshop that's going to show you how to book your next wedding in 30 days or less that I'll link to down in the video description. Also, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Sony, and this lens is on loan from them, and it will sadly be returning to them pretty soon, which is a bummer because it's really, really good. Anyways, what first struck me about this lens was the size and weight. At 918 grams, this 28 to 70 feels far closer in weight to something like Sony's original 24 to 70 Mark I GM lens. This new 28 to 70 only weighs 32 grams more than that old 24 to 70, which is totally wild and shows you just how much work Sony has put into decreasing the size and weight of this lens. If you allow me one more weight comparison now, remember how I mentioned at the start of this video that this new 28 to 70 is dramatically lighter than Canon's 28 to 70 option? I was not joking when I used the word dramatically. This new Sony is 36% lighter than the 28 to 70 from Canon. We're talking 918 grams for the Sony versus 1,430 for the Canon, or 2.02 pounds for the Sony versus 3.15 for Canon. Yes, Sony literally made this lens 1 pound lighter than what you get from Canon. Let's talk more about the size of this new Sony lens too. Let me preface by saying this is definitely a girthier lens. Bigger around than many of Sony's other options. You're not gonna be able to get your hand all the way around unless you have very large hands, but it's not uncomfortably large to hold, and it's only 92.9 millimeters in width compared to Canon's 28 to 70, which is 103.8 millimeters. Sony says their 28 to 70 is 11% smaller overall, and if you want a good idea of the size, this lens has an 86 millimeter filter thread on the front, and whenever you look at the length, it's about 20 millimeters longer than Sony's new 24 to 70 GM2 lens at the wide end. And then when you zoom it in and the lens extends, here's where it gets even more surprising because this lens barely extends. Look at it. This lens only gets about 3/4 of an inch longer when it extends. This is way less than how something like a 24 to 70 extends. And let me say too, the weight distribution shift whenever you zoom the lens in or out is incredibly minimal as well. Why should you care about this? Well, if you are a filmmaker and you commonly find yourself putting your camera on a gimbal like I do, you should be really excited about this because it means that you're not going to have to rebalance your gimbal whenever you zoom in and out. You don't even have to think about it once you initially balance the lens on the camera. It's awesome. And the only way that I could even feasibly think of this lens being improved is if Sony had opted to go for an internal zoom where the lens itself never extended at all and instead only moved the glass internally. That seems like something that would be relatively easy to do considering how short of an extension this lens has whenever you're zooming, but hey, I'm not an engineer in Japan making these things, and regardless, this is such a small weight shift that making the lens internal zoom wouldn't really make much, if any, of a difference, in my opinion. Wrapping up the weight and size portion of this review, I want to reiterate again that this lens is an f2. It's starting to rival a lot of prime lenses in regard to how much light it can let in, and to let in that much light, a lens usually needs to have a lot of glass, which is heavy because glass is heavy. But Sony have pulled off some technological wizardry to use dramatically less glass and keep the weight and size down. It's really impressive. Talking more about the f2 aperture now, whenever I saw this lens, I immediately thought back to a lens from Sigma that I had reviewed, their new 28 to 45 f1.8, which was a very impressive lens, but people had two complaints about that lens, with the first being that it only had a zoom range of 17 millimeters from wide to tight, which was not that large. This reduced the versatility of that Sigma, but here comes Sony with a lens that starts at the same width of 28 millimeters, but now gives you 42 millimeters of zoom range, making this lens dramatically more versatile. Oh, and the Sony also weighs 32 grams less than the Sigma. To be clear, the Sigma is also an f1.8 compared to the f2, but I really don't think you're going to notice a difference between these two lenses, and most of the filmmakers that I know would much rather have the extra zoom range versus an extra bit of light. We do need to talk about the other controversy of that Sigma 28 to 45mm lens though, and that is a controversy that this new Sony shares as well, because both of these lenses are 28mm on the wide end, and I've heard many complaints from filmmakers saying that this is not wide enough in their opinion. Sprinkle in some added spice of rumors leading up to the launch of this lens saying that this new Sony would be a 24 to 70 f2 and not a 28 to 70, and although I'm recording this review before this lens is released, once it's officially announced, I'm betting there are going to be some people that are upset, let's say, that this lens is not wider. To that, I would say remember that rumors are just rumors, and while it's fun to get excited about them, it's also really easy to overhype a lens, a camera, or any other product in your head before it's officially released and we know the exact specs. I do think that at some point we could see a 24 to 70 f2 from one of these lens manufacturers, but considering how much tech and research it looks like Sony put into developing this 28 to 70 to make it as small and light as possible, and I'm betting that to add those extra 4mm on the wide end would make this lens significantly heavier, larger, and more expensive, which Sony doesn't like to do. They like creating smaller, lighter weight lenses when they can, and as someone that films weddings and carries a camera and lenses around all day, I do appreciate that. So, just like with my Sigma 28 to 45 review, I don't think that this lens only being 28mm instead of 24mm is a deal breaker, and once you start to use it, you're not going to necessarily miss that extra width. But hey, that's just my opinion. If you are at all concerned, please consider renting this lens before you pony up literally thousands of dollars for it. I'll talk more about that soon. Back to the size and weight of this lens now though. All of these size and weight reductions wouldn't matter if the lens didn't create a high quality image. If it wasn't sharp, or it had a lot of weird distortion or distracting lens flares, etc. But I'm happy to tell you that this lens creates a very high quality image, and at f2 the bokeh looks gorgeous, and you can definitely tell that you're not using an f2.8 lens. All of the footage that I filmed with this lens was incredibly sharp, the colors looked great. It's everything that you would expect from a Sony GM lens, now at f2. Unfortunately, I don't have a Canon camera with their 28 to 70 to do a direct comparison to, but Sony were pretty darn emphatic whenever they showed me this lens, telling me that it was significantly sharper than the offering from Canon, especially in the corners of the image. Eventually, I'm hoping to get my hands on one of those and do a comparison between these two lenses. That could be a lot of fun. Back to this Sony lens though. As you would expect from a modern Sony lens, autofocus and manual focus performance were superb as well, and considering how much glass is having to be moved around in this lens, I was really impressed by how fast and accurate the autofocus was. Sony has been targeting having all of their lenses be capable of autofocusing at 120 frames per second, and this one can do that too, which is great to see. When I also tested focus breathing, I'm happy to tell you that it was very minimal, and in addition, because this is a Sony lens, it also supports their focus breathing compensation feature, which is in pretty much all of their newer cameras at this point, which essentially eliminates focus breathing with a very minimal crop, so you could just turn that on and not worry about it if you're stressed at all about focus breathing. Of course, this is also a modern GM lens, so it comes with all the features that you would expect, including 2 programmable buttons on the front, autofocus manual focus switch, aperture control ring with a switch to make it clickless, and another switch to lock the iris. In addition, you have another switch up here at the top that's very cool that lets you switch between having a smooth or tight zoom ring. So depending on the type of zooms that you're trying to do and how precise you want to be, you can flip this switch to adjust that as well. Now, let's talk price and should you buy it. Sony has told me they're targeting a price of $2,800 for this lens, which is definitely a healthy chunk of change. But whenever you consider that Canon has been charging $3,100 for their 28 to 70, suddenly Sony starts to look pretty competitive. And that's really what I feel like the entire creation of Sony's 28 to 70mm has been about. Competition. Sony looked at what Canon had made with their 28 to 70 and they said, give us a few years and we can make a lens that is 1 pound lighter, 11% smaller, sharper, and also $300 less expensive. People with Sony cameras don't have to be jealous of Canon having this lens. Maybe now it's time for Canon users to be jealous of Sony. So, should you buy it? in my opinion, if you're looking for an all-in-one lens that does a lot of things well, but a 24-70 at f2.8 is a little boring for you, let's say, let me just say that this 28-70 at only f2, on the other hand, is far more exciting. And if I was looking for a lens that could, say, film a wedding and still perform very well even at a very dark wedding reception, this is where I start to think that this lens really starts to shine as an all-in-one option that you could keep on your camera literally all day. If you can envision yourself doing that and using this lens the vast majority of the time, that's when I start to think that the high price is completely worth it. You can let me know in the comments what you think though. And while you're down there, I would love for you to check out my free wedding filmmaker gear guide. This guide is going to show you all of the equipment that you need to purchase to film a wedding, and it's going to help save you from wasting money on gear that you don't need. You can download it completely for free at the link down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.